Dies ist ein Webcast der Enterprise 2.0 Community mit Jon, einem kanadischen Experten für Organisationsmanagement. Er spricht zum Thema organisatorische Herausforderungen der Work 2.0 Umgebung.
All right. So, like all of us do now in this era, I suspect that most people who are listening now will have checked me out on Google, and so may have some idea. But what I would like to talk about is just summarize very quickly the conditions that we now have, and then go back a little bit in history, and then go forward a little bit, and talk about some of the general implications of where we're at now. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So I think it's no surprise to everybody that today most people, let's call them knowledge workers, not necessarily people doing more routine jobs, although information technology impacts those jobs as well, or that work. But most knowledge workers, the conditions we live in today are interconnectedness and constant flows of information that we are looking at on our screens all day long, whether that's email, articles, blog posts, wikis, search engines, lists, everything is on the screen, and we are interacting with words, images, and other people. That is starting to have significant impact on both organizational structures and the way things are managed. Now, some of you, or maybe all of you, might have seen an article that was on the web a few weeks ago in an American magazine by the name of the Atlantic Monthly, where the title of the article, and I don't know if my memory of the title is exactly accurate, but I think it was Freelancers - the New Industrial Revolution. In other words, what is starting to happen is work as we know it, and especially knowledge work, is in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, becoming much more temporary. You may be in an organization on a permanent basis, but much of the work is projects. And projects come, get accomplished, and then go, and then comes the next project. And it may not be the same people always on the same projects. Now, increasingly, and this is perhaps more true in North America and not so much in, let's say, Germany or France or Holland, also employment is much more temporary. And particularly amongst younger people, it seems as if most of them have jobs now that, if you're in a job for 5 years now in North America, that's a very long time. I just want to check right now and see if what I'm saying makes sense with everybody so far.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
And we have to see, the participants can only answer via chat then.
Yes, I realize that, but I've got my whiteboard open and I don't see anything. Maybe I need to open the chat. Okay, so I see yes, absolutely. And then die Runde ist noch quadratisch. I don't know what that means, excuse me. There are some very significant implications for that because virtually all of us that are in the workforce today are very familiar with middle-sized and large organizations and organizational charts and job descriptions and also competency models, but the assumption for at least the last 50 years, and certainly since the end of World War II, which is when organizations everywhere started to grow in size, along with things like suburbs and infrastructure for our societies, or at least modern infrastructure. The assumption was, and has been for a long time, that things were relatively stable and would only continue to grow. Now, most of the people that would be interested in Enterprise 2.0 will have heard of a school of thought called Taylorism from Frederick Winslow Taylor, who was a time and motions and efficiency expert in the early part of the 20th century. And the school of thought, or the philosophy known as Taylorism, is what came to organize work. It began to be, especially in the 1950s, as organizations were undergoing very rapid growth. That is what caused the spread or the proliferation of things like job descriptions and notions of fairly stable structures where work was divided into sets of tasks, departments and sets of tasks, and so on, that made sense because put together they resembled a finished jigsaw puzzle. They created the means for realizing the objectives of a certain type of work and, of course, a certain type of organization. We can think of that in the case of the examples that would still often be the case today, at least in people's minds, would be things like banks or governments or manufacturing operations of different sorts. However, and so along as that model continued to grow, it became more and more codified and more accepted as the way things were done, until it became effectively, I would say, in the 1970s and 1980s, the dominant model of how to structure both organizations and work. And from that came the codification of what is today called scientific management. There are ways to manage people in these kinds of structures with objectives that are derived from an organization's vision and strategies, and then cascaded down and broken up into the appropriate kinds of focus for different departments and different types of work. And that then figuratively and practically represents today's modern pyramid-like hierarchy. Everybody with me so far?
Yes.
Okay. Now, along came through the 90s, information technology began to be applied more and more to work. In the late 80s and early 90s, knowledge work was the place where two main kinds of information technology were applied, and that's really spreadsheets and word processing capabilities. And then in manufacturing and or service environments, the banks, for example, and other kinds of service organizations went through various forms, depending upon the context, of what's called electronic data interchange. And in manufacturing environments, we saw the early arrival of what's called MRP, Manufacturing Resource Planning, which then became ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning. And as that grew, we saw business process engineering and then large integrated information systems applied to work. That took us through most of the 90s, and from about 1995 on, we saw the appearance of first the browser, and I have a little anecdote to share. I keep a bad habit that I have is keeping business magazines. And about a year ago, I was cleaning out some of my old business magazines, and I found a well-known American business magazine called Fortune from I think 1994 or 95, and at that time there were something like only 50 or 55 American companies that had websites. So that was, literally only 16 years ago. As we progressed through the late 90s and into the early 2000s, of course, we saw the browser, graphic user interfaces, the dot-com boom, especially in North America, and then the dot-com bust. Then the famous 9/11, and businesses and companies everywhere adopted the notion of going back to basics, not experimenting much. And then at the same time, the beginnings of what we called Web 2.0 began. Early days of blogging, wikis, different kinds of exchanging online, the early versions of what is now Facebook, so things like Friendster, Tribe, and so on. Well, today we now have the web, collaborative platforms, the cloud, mobile devices everywhere, and so on. So we are beginning to take for granted that the future is increasingly interconnected and that we will all live and work in flows of information. So the implications for that, for me, and one of the reasons I think I have a profile in the Enterprise 2.0 space is about 10 years ago, a little bit more than 10 years ago, because I have been studying work design and organizational design for many, many years, about 30 years now. I coined a term that I call hierarchy, which I identified as an emergent organizing principle. The reason I chose the words organizing principle is because there are only a few words that end in archy, like monarchy, patriarchy, matriarchy, oligarchy, hierarchy, anarchy, and so on. And hierarchy has certainly been the dominant model, the way we arrange work based on a hierarchy of knowledge, typically, over the last 50 years. But now, because of all of the interconnection, the flows of information, the exchanges of information, and so on, what I did was I put together the ending, archy, with the notion that we live and work in a wired world, hence hierarchy. And I defined that as a dynamic two-way flow of power and authority based on knowledge, trust, credibility, and a focus on results. I believe that this has very large implications for knowledge work. As I started out saying, work as we know it has become more temporary, projects come and go, and we also now connect with people around a set of objectives, sometimes inside the organization, sometimes outside the organization, often both, and the projects get done and then we come and go. But the discovery of, the sharing of, and the use of pertinent knowledge and skills becomes the things that happen in these networks, in these connected networks of people. And hence the implications for knowledge work is that even every individual worker is becoming a set of skills, core skills that they have, knowledge that they have, abilities that they have, the personality that they bring to the work, their ability to connect socially or not. And these, as we go forward, will, I believe, increasingly need to become what I call reconfigurable. In other words, every time you join a new project, you will have to introduce yourself, you'll have to fit together with new people, you'll have to maybe use the skills you have slightly differently than you did in the last project, and slightly differently than you will in the next project, and so on. So I'll just stop there for a moment and check again with the attendees and see if there are any questions and if everybody's with me so far. Am I explaining myself clearly?
So if you have any questions, then please use the chat Otherwise, we can then continue. But you can see it, John, the chat.
Yes, I can. I have it on my screen. But so my question would be, so I see no questions at the moment, and I just want to double check and make sure that I'm being clear and that I don't sound like a madman.
Okay.
Everything's okay? Okay, so I got some comments here. Everything fine, okay, sure, you sound reasonable. All right, great, thank you. Now, there's some I think there are some very important implications for knowledge workers and also for managing knowledge workers. I'll go through those two, and that will be about all that I had to present. But some implications for knowledge workers everywhere is as we increasingly live and work in this environment, we come to understand information as currency or as the raw material of knowledge, and sharing that information is a core strategy for success, even in a corporate context. And what I mean by that is that when you're faced with having to do something, you have some skills and knowledge, but often you have a problem where you want to clarify things. And of course we have databases and reference sources and so on, but there's, I believe, quite a lot of research that shows in approximately 75 or 80% of the time what people do is they ask someone else that they know, either for, is this right, or do you know somebody that knows some information, or who can I go to find something out, or am I asking the right questions, and so on. So it's very much a social thing. This is the way humans have always operated, and it's very likely that this is the way humans will continue to operate. But increasingly, people are understanding that that's what is useful. And I want to open a small parenthesis here. One of the most important articles I've ever read about this, and in fact I read it about 2 days before I came up with the concept of hierarchy in late 1999, is an article by somebody that I think is known around the world. He's dead now, Peter Drucker, and the title was Beyond the Information Revolution. And in the last 7 paragraphs of that article, he said that increasingly with information technology and with the web, knowledge workers are effectively the people who now own the means of production. That means, that's figurative for saying it's ideas and knowledge that are adding value, typically. And he said that as more and more knowledge workers began to understand that, they would want to begin to share in the power of the decision-making about what kind of work is being done. In other words, share power with executives. And that was really the basis of thinking about hierarchy as opposed to a more traditional top-down hierarchy. Now, most knowledge workers, especially as they get more and more practiced at operating in an environment that is constantly full of flows of information, begin to start to think differently, and their thinking becomes informed by what is called systems thinking. In other words, they have a greater and wider awareness of contexts and what is being done and why it's being done, and hence there's more and more of a movement towards what's called co-creation, or building a vision, values, and objectives that everybody participates in building, or is more, at least is more inclusive than previously the 4 or 5 people who sit at the top of the organization deciding everything and then coming out of their office and saying, you all will do this, which is the classic command and control mindset. Am I still sounding reasonable? Just want to do a quick double check with everybody, with the panelists and audiences. Okay. Now, the ongoing implications of that mean that we begin to be in relatively constant interaction with people, and so we have to be able to get along with them, connect with them, understand what they're saying, be able to be clear and persuasive about what we're saying. And so the way that we communicate what we are trying to get done becomes increasingly important. We all become influencers. And increasingly, many of you may know of the field called social network analysis, which is a little bit like taking an X-ray of the organizational chart and being able to see the flows of information, the hubs where information gathers, the people that have influence, and so on. Now, this is all related back to, and it also informed the notion of, or the definition of hierarchy, it's all related back to the maxim that knowledge is power. Many of you may remember that at the beginnings of the widespread use of the Internet, there were many parallels drawn between the arrival of the Internet and the arrival of the Gutenberg printing press. The Gutenberg printing press had a lot of impact on society because it took the process of books, which previously had been handwritten by scribes and were really only available to the higher-up people in the church, cardinals and bishops, and the people in the courts of the royalty, the kings, queens, and the other nobles, and they spread that knowledge through books out through society. People tend to forget that took anywhere from 250 to 400 years to have very large impacts on the democratization of many societies, whereas now we're sometimes it seems like expecting that the Internet and the spread of information and often disinformation will have impact overnight. However, it seems clear that even only 15 or 20 years into the use of the Internet and networks, the impacts are being felt more and more every week or every month. The implication of that for knowledge workers, of course, is that, figuratively, anybody sitting in an organization with Google or other search engines at their fingertips and with access to different networks can, if they want to, know as much about, let's say, an industry or a particular type of problem as potentially the CEO or the directors would know. And so they become different in their expectations of how they are led, how they are managed, and where their ideas come from and with whom they interact in order to build greater understanding. So what it means is that we all, in a sense, can become moderate radicals. We want sensible change. And that has pretty significant implications for enterprises, especially where enterprises are used to the people at the top of the hierarchy making the decisions and then saying, just do what I say. So again, this concept of moderate radicals. And I guess the last point that I would want to make about knowledge workers is that because these flows of information and connection are going on all the time, we are now entering an era where continuous learning is becoming absolutely essential and essentially unavoidable. That means that we need to keep thinking critically as knowledge workers. We need to keep identifying what we need to know next. We need to understand what networks we're in and why we are in them. And we need to be able to move back and forth from network to network, from objective to objective, and so on. And this can be very difficult, both for individuals and for managers, because, again, coming back to the pyramidic and structured and relatively stable organization, often one of the reasons hierarchy persists at least traditional hierarchy, is because our role and how we understood ourselves and our identity was quite clear. We could identify who we were, what our title was, what was expected of us, and we knew how our day and our and our week and our month would unfold. So that can often be a source of anxiety and trouble. On the other hand, there are very significant opportunities when people begin to realize that they can reinvent themselves or find new opportunities and so on. And so I have a question here. If knowledge is power, what incentives or benefits do employees get for sharing their knowledge? Well, it's a good question. It's one that's been asked over and over and over again, and that's, in my opinion, where we get into the very deep issues often situated in the human resources department. I didn't really introduce myself properly, but for many years I was a remuneration or compensation and then organizational design and organizational change consultant for a very well-known large global consulting firm called Hay Management Consultants, or the Hay Group. And the way most compensation and performance management schemes in organizations are constructed, and I helped many of them, this is one of the things that Hay does with many organizations, is something that causes people to want to hold on to their knowledge because it's a source of power and a source of security for them. If they think, if I share my knowledge, if I give it away, then I'm vulnerable, I'm at risk, I might not be valuable anymore. So I don't have a good answer to your question. I know it's a question that's often asked. That was in response to Simon Hilsdorf's question. And if I were working with an organization, it's a question I would ask, and I would go about probably trying to get into a participative and inclusive process with workers to generate ideas and eventually solutions that everybody had ownership of and that they agreed would work. So to close off my presentation, there's a well-known business professor and academic by the name of Gary Hamel that wrote a book last year called 2 years ago, called The Future of Management for these new conditions, in which he said, much of what I've gone over about the last 75 years is saying there has been no innovation in management in the last 75 years. And I sort of picked what I'd call a polite argument with him where I disagreed and said, I think there actually has been innovation in management. It's just not called management. It's called organizational development. If you look at the history of organizational development work, it typically involves an inclusive and participative process where most people get involved in working at building an organization's or an enterprise's vision and objectives together so that there's more ownership and more empowerment. And I believe that that's also something that in the conditions of what I call hierarchy will happen more and more. It's a different kind of managing where there is more responsibility for self-management placed into groups of people and with individuals. In effect, we negotiate what we need to do, and our agreements become our structures. And that's about the end of what I have to say.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. If you have some questions, please use the chat tool. I have some questions. You are talking about knowledge workers and that they do have new expectations on the management and to join decisions and so on. Is it really all employees, or is it more the first movers, so that probably most of the knowledge workers or employees do not really know about their new role and the new possibilities?
I think that that's a very good question, and I think that we're in the middle of. So let me go back and start over. I think the concepts and the points I'm bringing up are going to take quite a few years to actually become very widespread. We hear a lot of what I would call marketing about Enterprise 2.0 and social business, and a lot of that is done by either collaborative platform vendors or by consulting firms who want to establish themselves in this new and emergent space. I think it's going to take quite a while, and I don't think all kinds of work are impacted in the same way. I think it depends upon the industry. It depends upon the types of work. Obviously some kinds of work, let's say, engineering work or medicine or certain kinds of things, there is an established body of knowledge, and a lot of the work is the application of existing knowledge. It's when we begin looking for either innovation or greater flexibility and responsiveness with customers, let's say, that the exchanges and a greater flow of information become more and more important. I also think that we are somewhere in the middle of typically senior people in organizations are from about age 45 on up to maybe 60 or 65, and are typically much less familiar with screens, with user interfaces, and with the gestures that involve different kinds of sharing of information and consuming flows of information, whereas people, of course, 15, 20, 25, maybe up to 30 or even 35 are much more familiar. So I think we will see this grow in its impact because, especially in the Western countries, so Western Europe and North America, the developed countries, we are also, we know, facing a growing demographic crisis. People are beginning to retire in very large numbers, and so in another 10 years or so, there will be relatively few people who today are, let's say, 45 or 50 left in the workplace, but the workplace will be full of people who have been used to Facebook and Twitter and sharing and collaboration, and so if they are not able to do that at work, they will wonder why they are not able to do that at work. So, I think we're in the middle, or maybe even in the early days still of this transition. I think much of the Enterprise 2.0 consulting that's being done today is focused more on the technology and tools, and so I think we'll see a lot of either failures or programs and change that doesn't result in a lot of deep change. But I think we will see that the conditions that are causing the need to change will not go away, and so we will see successive waves of trying to make these changes, and it will become eventually the sociology and the way things are managed that become the very important differentiators. Does that answer your question?
Yes. I have another one. How do you see the role of the middle management? I have a little bit the impression that at least in some companies they are more or less a little bit blocking this process, and is it your impression as well? And is it like this? What's the best way to work with these people?
Well, bluntly, yes, that is my impression, and there's, I believe, a good reason for it, because if we're talking about empowered workers and more self-management, either by groups and individuals, then the question becomes, what kind of value is a middle manager adding? And of course, that's very dangerous to somebody who's a middle manager. because as we talked about earlier, their identity as a middle manager, and in fact their power as a middle manager is something that they're seeing either erode or change. Now, those that become aware of it or can be helped to become aware of it can, I believe, change towards becoming much more of what I would call an enabler as opposed to a controller. So somebody that is helpful in creating the conditions for effective collaboration, who becomes more of a gardener instead of an engineer, if you want to use a metaphor for that. Is somebody who looks out for useful talent, who helps obstacles to effective collaboration be removed, who becomes a good facilitator and coach. So a term that I coined in the writings that I've done about hierarchy is helping, especially middle managers, transition from being the instruments of command and control to becoming instruments of championing, channeling, and coordinating. So by championing, I mean bringing what seem to be the good ideas forward. Channeling means finding and helping to find the resources to move forward, and coordinating, of course, means coordinating.
Oh, very interesting.
But it's risky times, and especially I think if middle managers are not open-minded or are wanting to deny that. One of the interesting things to me these days is that there is a lot of resistance, and there's sometimes resistance takes the form of denial. But you cannot deny that these conditions are everywhere. I mean, people are interconnected everywhere, and flows of information are happening every day.
So it's important for this transition process that somebody takes care about his middle management and to help them to change their way of working.
I agree with that very much.
Okay. I have another question. How do you see the role of internal communication in this process?
Well, I think it gets more and more important, and I think the one thing that, of course, the impacts of the web and hyperlinks have caused many people, everybody, to become aware of what's called transparency, and the issue with communications, both internal and external, has always been, but now it's been made more important, is essentially speak to us honestly. Tell us the information directly and honestly. There's a quotation I like to use from an academic at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and somebody that was very important in the world of e-learning, a man by the name of Michael Schrage, who said, networks make organizational culture and politics explicit. In other words, you can't hide and you can't lie. And so I think that makes if people, I think, are becoming better and better at understanding that they are being either misled or charmed, or we're trying to tell them something without really telling them something. So I just think that effective internal communications becomes increasingly important and timely and so on.
Okay.
I have a question from Simon again here saying, what do you think about the responsibility and the freedom of employees regarding communication or information in general? In my opinion, there's more and more information available, but employees need to choose for themselves what's important. Employees need a different mindset from push-to-pull communication. In general, I would agree with that. In the early days of considering, I guess the first wave of all this was when some companies, and mainly information technology companies, and I suspect mainly in the United States, began to use blogs internally, and Microsoft, of course, had the relatively famous Robert Scoble as an external blogger, but there was a lot of discussion about corporate blogging policies and guidelines and so on, and Microsoft became famous for having a very simple one. It was "Don't be stupid." I think that these conditions at the individual level, and particularly for employees, one of the things that this does is it creates more responsibility for critical thinking and for making intelligent choices about how to respond to things. So if you're someone who is a chronic complainer, or as we say in North America, a shit disturber, somebody that likes to stir up the pot just for the sake of stirring up the pot, this becomes more problematic. On the other hand, it's also important to, I guess the polar opposite of that is where in a given organizational culture, people become afraid to really speak their mind. Yes, employees need to choose what's important, not necessarily for themselves. I really do like the Microsoft policy of "don't be stupid." I mean, you can choose for yourself to be strident or to speak out strongly, and that might be suicidal in terms of losing your job. On the other hand, it's pretty dissatisfying if you're an employee that cares about the work and wants to do well and has a good idea, and you feel scared to bring this idea up or say something. So yes, it's a change. It's an important change, and it is then related, of course, to the organizational culture and how well a given organization encourages people to speak up and speak out, and then what is done with the ideas and information that are part of that push and pull communication. Does that answer your question partly, Simon? Okay, partly, yes.
Okay. John, do you see the question from Stefan Schillerwein?
I do not.
Okay, then I read it. With everything becoming more temporary and more interconnected, do you think that closed internal social media will cease to have a reason for existence and everything will move to the web and be controlled by everyone individually?
I'll answer that, and I also will, Simon has also asked another question, and I'll read that out after this. Would you mind just repeating the question that you read out, just to make sure that we're all clear on it?
Okay, I will try.
It was about the web being dominant and having a wide range of tools. Is that correct?
No, I think it's more the question that whether it's a good way to do it all internally, or it will be moved to the web and controlled by everyone individually, so that you can control where it will be.
Well, I don't think it'll be either of those extremes. I think that it depends upon the organization, and it depends upon the kind of work. And I think that in some places, for different reasons, some of that will be the corporate culture set by, the senior managers or the owners, that there will be closed internal social media, and they won't always be open to the external world, and so there will be a reason for using internal social media, and it will stay within the fortress walls, if you will. I think that there's a significant trend, but I think it will also take quite a few years of companies considering moving some or maybe all of what they do to the cloud and to the web. And that has implications for the use of applications and tools both by work groups, by departments, and by individuals. There's also the additional complicating factor of, especially as younger employees come along, although we've seen more and more articles about this, of, I might like to use my laptop and a BlackBerry to do my work, whereas someone else says, no, sorry, I don't use laptops anymore. Desktop is in my garage, and for me it's iPad and iPhone. So the issue of having common spaces and platforms where people can interact, but through the use of different devices and from different places, is, I think, going to become increasingly more strategic. Simon's question says, I'm also interested in your take on the current information overload. Well, again, a very good question. The way I often respond to that is that I I make comparisons to existing in continuous flows of information to something like the process of learning how to pilot a kayak or swim in whitewater rapids in a river. Or also another allegory for that would be learning a second or a third or a foreign language. You get better at it, and you begin to develop different structures and processes of cognition to identify what's important and what's useful to pay attention to and what's not. It's not easy. It takes work. But you have to learn what to pay attention to and why, and also have rules and filters, but also, and this is where it gets really tricky, remember that sometimes the most useful information or connections come from things that you should not have been paying attention to, or that maybe come from, outside of the defined field of activity or field of vision. So that's why I use the metaphor of whitewater. I started working in and on the web probably 10, 11, 12 years ago, and that's why I use the metaphor of learning a foreign language, because I'm much more at ease with it, and I believe that I have a much more highly developed sense of intuition and awareness today than I had, let's say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So it's a question of your own knowing more about yourself, knowing your own style of consuming information, of creating information, knowing what kinds of filters work for you, developing different kinds of discipline than you may have had before. So, as I said, lots like learning a foreign language. From Simon, should this be an individual task or should it also become a task of managers and corporation? Well, I think both. I think that there should probably be, just like corporations have often over the last 15 or 20 years offered courses to employees in, let's say, time management or word processing skills or various forms of personal development skills or career planning skills or whatever. I think that there should be probably courses, training, social learning opportunities, discussions about the implications of information overload and ways to work with information. But I think individuals should also be taking responsibility for their own personal effectiveness. It will only be good for them because, as I have mentioned a couple times, and I will always repeat, the conditions that we're facing today are not going to magically disappear. They're going to intensify and amplify. Any other questions? I've probably gone over time now. It looks like we're closing in on about an hour, and I thought it was going to be about half an hour.
Okay. So I think we had a lot of useful information. Thank you very much, Jon.
Any other questions? Was this conversation useful?
I think so. For me, it's very good.
Okay. Bjorn just sent me something on Skype. Just wrap up. So organizational structures in an interconnected work environment tend to be formed around influencing hubs, yes, and around objectives. I think the defining structure of work in an interconnected, information flow-based environment is, what are the objectives? What do we need to get done and why? Management is a question on governing the structure of hubs, yes, and governing the dynamics of the flow. And in terms of identifying and favoring the right hubs and discussions, championing, selecting and promoting the right discussions, which is channeling and coordinating the effects of these three factors. And then he asks, is that right? And I would say yes. That's why I think hierarchy is an emergent organizing principle. My hope and my belief is that in another 20 years, it will be recognized as this is really what the transition from the industrial era has created, and it will be recognized as such.
Okay. And then thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for asking me to join you, and I hope it's useful. I'm always glad to be in connection and exchange with people. I'm easily accessible. Although I live in Vancouver, Canada, I also live in and on the web. I'm available at hierarchy.com, and my email is jon.husband@gmail.com. Jon is spelled without an H. And if anybody wants to be in contact with me, please feel free.
Okay. Thank you very much for this interesting hour. I will send you your contact details to the participant afterwards tomorrow, okay. And so they can stay in contact with you. And so then I wish everyone a nice evening.
Thank you very much.
Probably we can do it again.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.